Charleston's oldest auction records contain an anomaly that city archivists deliberately removed from public view in 1891. Among thousands of documented sales from the Ryan's Mart auction house, one transaction stands impossibly alone. A single woman was purchased 17 separate times by 17 different plantation owners across South Carolina between March and November of 1844. Each sale commanded progressively higher prices. Each buyer was a prominent member of Charleston society. The municipal record shows something that shouldn't exist. The same individual woman, identified by identical physical descriptions and an unusual marking, was sold repeatedly over 8 months while city officials documented every transaction with meticulous precision. No historical precedent exists for this pattern. No logical explanation appears in any surviving correspondence from that year. And when the South Carolina Historical Society finally cataloged these documents in 1923, they placed them in restricted archives with a single notation: requires gubernatorial approval for access. Public interest concerns. Before we continue with the story of what happened at Ryan's Mart in 1844, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I love hearing where our audience discovers these forgotten chapters of American history. Now, let's examine what those 17 transactions actually reveal about the darkness that consumed Charleston's elite that year. The spring of 1844 brought unusual weather to Charleston, a persistent fog that rolled in from the harbor each morning and lingered past noon, wrapping the city's narrow streets in damp, gray silence. The auction houses along Chalmers Street operated regardless, their daily sales continuing with mechanical regularity as they had for decades. Ryan's Mart stood among the most prestigious, a 3-story brick building where South Carolina's wealthiest planters came to acquire labor for their vast rice and cotton holdings. Thomas Gadsden managed Ryan's Mart with the precision of a banker, which he had been before entering the auction trade in 1837. At 42 years old, he maintained detailed ledgers that tracked every sale with accounting thoroughness: names, ages, physical descriptions, prices, buyer information, seller details. His records became known throughout Charleston for their accuracy, used in legal disputes and estate settlements. Gadsden employed 4 assistants who inspected merchandise before auctions, verified documentation, and ensured transactions proceeded according to South Carolina law. The city itself sprawled along the peninsula where the Ashley and Cooper rivers met the Atlantic. Its economy was built almost entirely on slave labor and the crops that labor produced. Charleston's elite, the Pringles, Ravenels, Alstons, Hoogies, controlled vast fortunes accumulated over generations. Their competition extended beyond mere wealth into social standing, political influence, and the subtle demonstrations of power that defined Southern aristocracy. Each spring brought the planting season, and with it planters seeking to expand their operations or replace workers lost to disease, injury, or the brutal mathematics of mortality inherent to the system. March 19th arrived with that characteristic fog, and with it, a seller Gadsden had never encountered before. The man identified himself as Nathaniel Claiborne, a factor representing a Savannah estate. He brought papers documenting ownership of a woman he claimed had been household staff, now being sold due to the estate's dissolution. The woman stood apart from others awaiting sale that day. Her bearing suggested education unusual for the enslaved, her expression carefully neutral in a way that spoke of practiced control. Gadsden recorded her details in his ledger with customary precision: approximately 28 years of age, literate, experienced in household management, fluent in French, skilled at needlework and music, with an unusual birthmark on her left shoulder blade, 3 dots forming a perfect triangle, each about the size of a pea. He assigned her the inventory number 84473 and noted the name Claiborne provided, Deline. The auction proceeded normally. Gadsden had conducted thousands of such sales, and this one followed familiar patterns. Planters inspected the merchandise, asked questions about health and abilities, calculated potential value. But the bidding for Deline exceeded anything Gadsden had witnessed in 7 years of managing Ryan's Mart. Colonel William Hainsworth, who owned 3 rice plantations totaling 9,000 acres in the Georgetown district, opened bidding at $800, already an extraordinary sum for a female slave, regardless of accomplishments. Hampton Pinckney, whose family controlled coastal holdings from Charleston to Beaufort, immediately countered with $1,000. The bidding escalated rapidly, far surpassing any rational economic calculation of a slave's productive value. When the hammer finally fell, Robert Drayton, patriarch of one of South Carolina's oldest families, had paid $2,800. The amount represented roughly 10 times the typical price for a skilled female slave. Other planters in attendance exchanged glances but said nothing. Gadsden documented the sale with his usual thoroughness, noting the price, buyer's name, and date. Drayton arranged for DeLine's transport to his Ashley River plantation and departed. 3 days later, Nathaniel Claiborne returned to Ryan's Mart with the same woman carrying fresh papers documenting his authority to sell her again. Gadsden's careful composure fractured for the first time in his professional career. "Sir, I personally witnessed Colonel Drayton purchase this woman just 72 hours ago. The transaction appears in my ledgers with complete documentation." Claiborne's expression remained placid, almost amused. "I represent Mr. Drayton's interests now. Circumstances have changed regarding his acquisition. The sale was conducted legally, but Mr. Drayton has decided she doesn't suit his household requirements. He's authorized me to handle her resale." "Colonel Drayton is among Charleston's most respected planters," Gadsden said carefully. "It seems extraordinary that he would make such a costly error in judgment." Nevertheless, Claiborne placed the papers on Gadsden's desk. "Everything is in order. You'll find Mr. Drayton's signature authorizing the resale properly witnessed and notarized. Unless you're suggesting there's some irregularity in the documentation." Gadsden examined the papers. They appeared legitimate: Drayton's distinctive signature, proper legal language, a notary seal he recognized from other transactions. The situation violated no law. Slaves were property, and property could be sold repeatedly if owners chose. Yet something about the circumstances felt profoundly wrong in ways Gadsden couldn't articulate. He accepted the consignment. The auction took place 4 days after the first sale. This time, the bidding began at $1,000 and climbed even more rapidly. Gadsden noticed that some planters who'd bid previously were absent, while others who hadn't participated before now competed aggressively. The pattern felt deliberate, though Gadsden couldn't determine the underlying strategy. Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, cousin to Hampton Pinckney and owner of vast Indigo Holdings, ultimately purchased DeLine for $3,200. He signed the paperwork without expression and arranged for her transport to his plantation near Walterboro. Gadsden watched Claiborne depart and felt a cold certainty settle in his chest: the factor would return. He did, exactly 1 week later, with identical documentation authorizing resale on behalf of Charles Coatsworth Pinckney. By the 4th sale in mid-April, patterns had emerged that Gadsden documented with increasing unease. Each buyer was a prominent planter with impeccable social standing. Each paid substantially more than the previous purchaser. Each subsequently authorized resale through Claiborne within days of acquisition, citing vague unsuitability for their household needs. And each transaction was perfectly legal, with documentation that withstood Gadsden's increasingly suspicious scrutiny. The woman herself, DeLine, maintained the same careful neutrality throughout each auction, answering questions politely when addressed, standing with quiet dignity during inspections, showing no reaction to the escalating prices or the bizarre repetition of her sales. Gadsden found her composure more unsettling than any distress would have been. She seemed to expect this pattern, as if the impossibility of her situation was exactly as it should be. Charleston's auction houses operated within a community where information traveled quickly despite, or perhaps because of, social hierarchies built on discretion and carefully maintained appearances. Gadsden began hearing whispers about the repeated sales, though no one spoke directly about what was happening. Other auction managers asked casual questions about his business. Factors and agents who normally competed for consignments avoided Ryan's Mart when Claiborne was present. By the 6th sale in early May, Gadsden noticed something else. The planters who purchased DeLine were changing in subtle ways. Robert Drayton, who'd made the first purchase, now rarely appeared in Charleston society. His wife had left their Ashley River plantation to stay with family in Columbia, citing concerns about her health. Charles Coatsworth Pinckney, the second buyer, had withdrawn from his usual activities at the Charleston Library Society and the Street Cecilia Society balls. The third buyer, Augustus Huger, had dismissed his overseer and was personally managing his plantation's operations for the first time in 20 years, refusing visitors. The prices continued climbing. By July, the line sold for $6,000 to Theodore Gallard, a figure so astronomical it represented the equivalent of 6 skilled male field hands or 3 years' average profit from a medium-sized plantation. Gadsden's ledgers documented each transaction with the same methodical precision, but he'd begun adding private notations in a separate journal he kept locked in his desk. "The buyers are not acting rationally," he wrote after the 9th sale in August. "They bid against each other with an intensity that transcends economic logic. I've watched men who are normally shrewd negotiators abandon all restraint. They seem compelled to purchase her regardless of cost, as if driven by something beyond mere desire for valuable property." What Gadsden couldn't document in his ledgers were the conversations he began having in private with some of Charleston's other professional managers, factors who handled plantation business, attorneys who drew up sales contracts, bankers who extended credit for slave purchases. Each had noticed similar anomalies that year, though none could explain them. "Hampton Pinckney came to me last month requesting a loan against his property," Jonathan Wilmot, a prominent Charleston banker, told Gadsden over dinner at the Charleston Club. Wilmot spoke quietly, aware that even mentioning such matters violated the discretion expected in their social circle. "He's never needed credit before. His family's holdings generate enormous annual income, but he'd somehow exhausted his liquid capital and needed $15,000 immediately. When I asked about the circumstances, he became agitated, insisted it was a private matter. I granted the loan based on his family's standing, but the situation troubled me. A man of his wealth doesn't suddenly require that kind of emergency credit without significant cause." "Did he mention what depleted his funds?" Gadsden asked. Wilmot glanced around the dining room before responding. "He mentioned making an investment that didn't yield expected returns. Said he needed to recoup losses from a business venture that had proven unsuitable. Those were his exact words, unsuitable. The same term that appeared in the resale authorizations Claiborne brought to Ryan's Mart. Gadsden began investigating more actively, though he wasn't certain what he was investigating or why it mattered to him. The transactions were legal. The buyers were willing participants. No law was being violated. Yet the pattern felt like a violation of some deeper order, something fundamental to how the world should operate. In September, Gadsden made a decision that he recognized might destroy his professional reputation. He hired a private inquiry agent, a former Charleston constable named David Brunson, who now conducted discreet investigations for attorneys and businessmen who needed information gathered quietly. "I want you to trace what happens after each sale," Gadsden told Brunson, providing copies of his ledger entries. "Contact the buyers if you can do so without drawing attention. Find out what made them decide to resell. Learn anything you can about their experiences with this woman." Brunson worked for 3 weeks, traveling to plantations across the Carolina Lowcountry, speaking with overseers, household staff, and occasionally the planters themselves under various pretexts. What he reported back confirmed Gadsden's growing suspicion that something profoundly wrong was unfolding. "Not one of the planters kept her longer than 5 days," Brunson said, spreading his notes across Gadsden's desk after hours when the auction house was empty. "Most sent her back to Charleston within 48 hours. I spoke with Augustus Huger's overseer, a man named Price, who's worked that plantation for 30 years. He said Huger purchased the woman with specific instructions. She was to work in the main house, personal attendance on Mrs. Huger. But the very first evening, something happened. Price doesn't know what. He only knows that Huger emerged from the house at dawn, had the woman confined in the overseer's cabin, and sent word to Charleston that day arranging her resale." "Did Huger explain why?" Gadsden asked. "Said she was unsuitable. Those exact words again. Price told me he'd never seen Mr. Huger look the way he did that morning. Said the men seemed to have aged 10 years overnight. Wouldn't discuss it further." Brunson consulted his notes. "Theodore Gallard kept her 3 days. His body servant, a man named Marcus, who's been with the Gallard family since Theodore was born, told me Mr. Gallard locked himself in his study with the woman for hours that first night. Marcus heard conversation, not raised voices, not conflict, just talking hour after hour. When Mr. Gallard finally emerged, he looked in Marcus' words like he'd seen the devil himself. Arranged for her return to Charleston immediately. Similar accounts emerged from every buyer. None would discuss details. All used variations of the same explanation, unsuitable for their needs, and all seemed fundamentally altered by whatever had occurred during their brief ownership. "There's something else," Brunson said. "I did some checking on this factor, Nathaniel Claiborne. Can't find any record of him operating in Savannah or anywhere else in Georgia before March of this year. No business registration, no property holdings, no family connections I can trace. It's as if he appeared specifically to handle these sales and exists for no other purpose." "Have you tried locating him between sales?" Gadsden asked. "He stays at a boarding house on Queen Street when he's in Charleston, but several times I've watched the place and I've never seen him enter or leave. The landlady says he pays in advance, keeps to himself, and she rarely sees him. Yet somehow he's always present when another sale is scheduled." Gadsden stared at his ledgers with their meticulous documentation of impossible events. "What about the woman herself? Did you learn anything about her background?" Brunson's expression grew troubled. "That's where things become truly strange. I found the estate in Savannah that Claiborne claimed to represent, the Beaumont estate, owned by a family that made their fortune in cotton factoring. The estate was dissolved in early 1844, exactly as Claiborne stated. But when I examined their property records, there's no listing for any slave named Deline or matching her description in their holdings at the time of dissolution. In fact, the Beaumont estate's final inventory filed with the Chatham County Court shows only 11 slaves total, all male field workers, who were sold to various buyers in January of that year." "Then where did she come from?" "I don't know," Brunson admitted. "I've searched slave manifests from ships arriving in Savannah and Charleston over the past 2 years. Nothing. I've examined estate sales and auction records from across Georgia and South Carolina. Nothing matches her description or that unusual birthmark you noted. It's as if she simply appeared with Claiborne in March with falsified documentation that somehow passes legal scrutiny despite being completely fabricated." Before Gadsden could respond, they heard footsteps in the hallway outside his office. Both men froze. The auction house should have been empty. Gadsden had sent his assistants home hours earlier, and he'd locked the street entrance himself. The door opened without a knock. Nathaniel Claiborne stood in the doorway, his expression as placid as always. "Good evening, Mr. Gadsden," he said calmly. "I see you've been conducting research into my business affairs. I thought we might have a conversation about the questions you've been asking." Gadsden stood slowly, positioning himself between Claiborne and the ledgers spread across his desk. Brunson's hand moved subtly toward the pistol he carried inside his coat, a weapon he'd retained from his years as a constable. "Your business affairs have created considerable interest," Gadsden said, keeping his voice steady. "Sales of the same individual over 8 months represents an unprecedented pattern. I have obligations to maintain the integrity of this establishment." "You fulfilled those obligations admirably," Claiborne replied. "Every transaction has been properly documented. Every legal requirement has been met. I'm not aware of any statute or regulation that limits how many times property may be resold. The law may permit it," Gadsden said carefully, "but the patterns suggest something beyond normal commercial activity. The buyers are all prominent men who've suffered significant consequences from their purchases. Several have experienced serious financial strain. Others have withdrawn from society. I've documented changes in behavior that suggest these transactions involve more than simple dissatisfaction with the purchase." Claiborne moved further into the office, and Gadsden noticed for the first time how the man seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a quality that made him seem less substantial than he should be, as if he existed slightly out of phase with his surroundings. "Mr. Gadsden, you're a careful man. You maintain excellent records. You follow procedures precisely. These are admirable qualities in your profession." Claiborne's tone remained conversational, almost friendly. "But you're asking questions that have no answers you'll find satisfactory. The transactions will continue. 2 more sales remain to be completed. I suggest you document them as you have the others and allow events to proceed naturally. 2 more sales, Gadsden repeated. You're speaking as if the sequence has a predetermined ending. Everything has an ending, Mr. Gadsden. Some endings are more carefully planned than others. Brunson stepped forward, his hand now openly resting on his pistol. I was a constable for 12 years. I've investigated fraud, forgery, conspiracy. The documentation you're presenting is falsified. The woman you're selling has no legitimate origin in any slave manifests or estate records. Whatever you're doing operates outside legal boundaries, regardless of how proper your papers appear. Legal boundaries, Claiborne said thoughtfully. Tell me, Mr. Brunson, how many thousands of human beings have been bought and sold in Charleston over the past century? How many families separated? How many lives destroyed? All within perfect legal boundaries. The law has proven remarkably flexible regarding who can be considered property. My activities exist well within that flexibility. You're not answering the fundamental question, Gadsden said. What is she? Where did she come from? And what happens to the men who purchase her? Claiborne's expression shifted slightly, the first real emotion Gadsden had seen from him, something that might have been satisfaction, or perhaps simply acknowledgement that certain truths could no longer be avoided. What she is, Claiborne said slowly, is exactly what Charleston's elite have always desired. An acquisition that demonstrates wealth, taste, and power. Someone educated, accomplished, beautiful, property that elevates the owner's status simply through possession. The men who've purchased her wanted precisely that. They bid against each other, not just for her labor or skills, but for the prestige of ownership. That doesn't explain the pattern, Gadsden insisted. It doesn't explain why they all resell her immediately. Doesn't it? Claiborne tilted his head slightly. Consider what happens when acquisition becomes reality. When these men, pillars of Charleston society, owners of vast holdings built entirely on enslaved labor, find themselves alone with property they now control completely. Property that can speak, reason, question. Property that knows things about them, their debts, their secrets, their cruelties, their fears. The specific ways they've built their fortunes through methods that shame them in the darkness before dawn, even as they defend those methods publicly in daylight. The office fell silent except for the distant sound of carriages on the street outside. She talks to them, Brunson said quietly. That's what this is about. She tells them things. She converses with them, Claiborne corrected. About history, philosophy, the particular calculations required to value human beings as livestock, the specific decisions that lead men to purchase other human beings and call it economic necessity, the precise moral cost of building wealth through suffering. She's extremely well educated, you see. She can discuss these topics with considerable nuance. Gadsden felt ice forming in his stomach. And after these conversations, they send her back. They send her back, Claiborne agreed. Because continuing to own her becomes unbearable. Because every moment in her presence forces them to confront truths they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Because she represents a mirror they cannot face. So they resell her at a loss, often a substantial loss, just to escape that confrontation. But the next buyer doesn't know. The previous owner won't explain what happened. Can't, really. How do you tell another man of your social standing that you purchased a slave who destroyed your peace of mind simply by existing in your household? How do you admit that level of weakness? So each buyer enters the transaction with the same arrogant confidence as his predecessor. Each believes he'll be different. And each discovers the same truth. This is some form of revenge, Gadsden said, against Charleston's planters specifically. Revenge implies anger, Claiborne said. This is simply education, a demonstration of certain principles. The men who purchase her learn precisely what it means to own another human being. Not in abstract economic terms, but in the specific, intimate reality of that relationship. Most people never truly contemplate what they're participating in. She ensures these particular men do contemplate it. Thoroughly. Brunson's hand tightened on his pistol. I could arrest you right now, bring you before a magistrate, force you to explain these activities to the authorities. You could try, Claiborne said calmly. But explain exactly what crime has been committed. Every sale has been legal. Every document authentic enough to pass scrutiny for men whose profession involves examining such documents. No violence has occurred. No threats have been made. I've simply facilitated transactions between willing buyers and sellers. If the buyers subsequently regret their purchases, that's a private matter between them and their consciences. 2 more sales, Gadsden said. You mentioned 2 more remain. Why a specific number? What happens after the 17th sale? Claiborne moved toward the door. The sequence will complete itself. The final buyer will receive exactly what he deserves, and then the cycle will end. I suggest you document those last transactions carefully, Mr. Gadsden. They may prove historically significant. He departed without waiting for a response, leaving Gadsden and Brunson alone with questions that multiplied faster than answers could form. The 16th sale occurred on October 3rd, and Gadsden recognized the winning bidder immediately, James Henry Hammond, former governor of South Carolina, congressman, and owner of multiple plantations totaling over 10,000 acres. Hammond was also among Charleston's most controversial figures, brilliant, ambitious, and allegedly involved in various scandals that his political allies had worked hard to suppress. Hammond paid $7,200 for DeLine, a sum that represented the highest price ever documented in Gadsden's ledgers for any slave. He signed the paperwork with a flourish and arranged for her transport to his Silver Bluff plantation near Augusta. 4 days later, Claiborne returned with resale authorization. But this time, something was different. The factor's usual composure had fractured slightly, subtle signs of tension around his eyes, a tightness in his jaw that suggested stress or perhaps anticipation. Mr. Hammond discovered she was extremely unsuitable for his household, Claiborne said, placing the papers on Gadsden's desk. He's authorized immediate resale with no minimum price requirement. Gadsden examined the documentation and noticed Hammond's signature appeared rushed, the letters uneven in ways that suggested the hand that wrote them had been shaking. Additional notations filled the margins, calculations, crossed-out figures, notes that seemed to represent attempts at quantifying something that resisted quantification. What did she say to him? Gadsden asked quietly. Claiborne met his gaze directly for the first time in all their interactions. She recited his specific financial debts, the amounts he owes various creditors, the methods he's used to extract additional productivity from his slaves, methods that violate South Carolina law in ways that would destroy his political career if made public. She discussed certain relationships he's maintained that would scandalize his family. And she asked him questions about how he reconciles his public advocacy for states' rights and Southern honor with the particular cruelties he's inflicted on people he owns. Former Governor Hammond found the conversation deeply educational. You're destroying these men, Gadsden said. They're destroying themselves, Claiborne corrected. I'm simply facilitating their education. They chose to participate in this system. They chose to build their fortunes through ownership of human beings. She merely ensures they understand the full implications of those choices. The 17th sale attracted an unusual crowd. Planters who normally attended auctions but who'd been absent during previous sales of DeLine, along with several factors and agents whose presence suggested they were representing buyers who didn't want to be identified publicly. Gadsden recognized the pattern immediately. Word had spread through Charleston's elite about the remarkable woman who'd been sold repeatedly, and men were now coming specifically to acquire her, despite not knowing why previous buyers had resold her. The bidding opened at $5,000 and climbed rapidly. Gadsden watched faces in the crowd and saw expressions that troubled him, not just the usual calculation of men assessing property value, but something more intense. Desire mixed with something darker. A need to possess something that had supposedly unmanned other buyers. A competitive urge to prove themselves stronger, more worthy, more capable of mastering what others couldn't control. When the hammer fell, the winning bidder was John Calhoun Preston, a 34-year-old planter whose family holdings included some of South Carolina's most profitable cotton plantations. Preston came from impeccable lineage. His uncle was John C. Calhoun, the recently deceased senator who'd been one of the most powerful defenders of slavery in American history. Preston himself had distinguished himself in the Mexican War and was being groomed for political office. He paid $8,400, a figure that seemed to embody all the accumulated madness of the preceding sales. Gadsden documented the transaction with hands that had begun to tremble. 17 sales completed. 2 more remaining, according to Claiborne's statement weeks earlier. But the factor had said 17 total, and 17 had now been recorded. Unless Gadsden had misunderstood, unless the pattern extended beyond what he'd been told. That night, unable to sleep, he returned to his office and examined his ledgers again. He traced the pattern of sales, the escalating prices, the increasing prominence of buyers, and he realized with cold certainty that the sequence was building towards something specific. The 16th sale would be the penultimate transaction. The 17th would be the conclusion. But who would the final buyer be? And what made that particular transaction the ending point? 3 days after Preston's purchase, Claiborne returned. But this time, he wasn't alone. Deline accompanied him, and Gadsden saw immediately that something had changed. Her careful neutrality had shifted into something harder, more focused. She looked directly at Gadsden for the first time in all the months of repeated sales, and her eyes held an intelligence that seemed to pierce through whatever comfortable illusions he'd maintained about this situation. Mr. Preston discovered certain incompatibilities, Claiborne said, placing papers on the desk. The resale authorization is properly executed. However, for this transaction, there will be specific requirements regarding the buyer. What requirements? Gadsden asked. The 17th sale must go to someone with direct authority over this auction house. Someone whose business depends on facilitating these transactions. Someone who's documented every sale meticulously and who's been asking questions about the pattern. Claiborne's expression remained neutral, but his meaning was perfectly clear. The 17th sale must be to you, Mr. Gadsden. Gadsden felt the floor seem to drop away beneath him. That's impossible. I'm the auctioneer. I don't purchase merchandise. And I don't have that kind of capital available. You have assets, Claiborne said. This building, your business, your reputation. Various creditors would extend loans against those holdings if you provided proper security. You could arrange the necessary financing within 48 hours if you chose to do so. Why would I choose to do so? Gadsden demanded. I've watched 16 men purchase her and regret it. I've documented the damage these transactions have caused. I have no desire to become the 17th victim of whatever you've orchestrated. Deline spoke for the first time in Gadsden's presence, a voice educated and precise with only the faintest trace of accent that might have been French, or possibly something else entirely. Because you've spent 7 years facilitating sales of human beings while maintaining careful documentation that allows you to pretend you're simply a professional conducting business. Because you've made your living from other people's suffering while telling yourself that you're just the middleman, that you're not responsible for the system itself. Because you deserve to experience what it means to actually own someone rather than just processing the paperwork for other men's ownership. Her words struck with surgical precision. Gadsden had told himself variations of those exact justifications thousands of times over the years. He was just the auctioneer. He didn't own plantations. He didn't work slaves in fields. He simply facilitated transactions the same way bankers facilitated loans or factors facilitated trade. He was a professional providing a service. I won't do it, Gadsden said. I refuse to participate. Then the pattern ends here, Claiborne said. Incomplete. The lesson will remain unfinished. He gathered the papers from the desk. Of course, that means certain information about your business practices might become public. The private arrangements you've made with buyers to conceal the true ages of children sold. The documentation you falsified to present sick slaves as healthy. The specific ways you've helped planters avoid legal restrictions on separating families. I have extensive records of your activities, Mr. Gadsden. You've been very thorough in your ledgers, but not quite thorough enough about which of those ledgers you've kept private. Gadsden's blood turned to ice. The accusations were accurate. He had bent rules, falsified occasional documents, helped buyers work around legal restrictions, all in the name of maintaining his business, all justified as necessary accommodations to commercial reality. Nothing that other auctioneers didn't do. Nothing that seemed criminal in the context of the trade itself. But exposed to public scrutiny, especially scrutiny from the increasingly vocal abolitionist newspapers in the North, those practices would destroy him. "You're blackmailing me," Gadsden said quietly. "I'm offering you an educational opportunity," Claiborne corrected. "You can decline, but declining has consequences just as participation has consequences. Life offers us choices, Mr. Gadsden. Rarely simple ones." For 3 days, Gadsden struggled with the decision. He examined his finances. He considered fleeing Charleston entirely, abandoning the business and starting over somewhere far from South Carolina. He contemplated going to authorities and explaining everything, though he couldn't imagine how that conversation would proceed or what laws had actually been violated. In the end, he made the choice he knew he would make from the moment Claiborne had presented the ultimatum. He secured loans against his business and property. He arranged financing that would take him years to repay. And on October 19, 1844, he purchased a line for $9,000, a sum that represented everything he'd accumulated over 7 years in the auction trade. The transaction was properly documented. Gadsden signed his name in his own ledger, officially becoming a slave owner for the first time in his life. The irony burned like acid. "She'll be at the auction house tomorrow evening," Claiborne said. "I suggest you arrange for privacy. The education she provides works best without interruption." That night, Gadsden barely slept. He knew what was coming, had known from watching 16 other men go through this process. She would talk to him, ask him questions, force him to confront truths about himself that he'd spent years avoiding. When he arrived at Ryan's Mart the next evening, DeLine was waiting in his office. Claiborne had departed, leaving them alone in the 3-story building that represented Gadsden's entire professional identity. "Sit down, Mr. Gadsden," she said. "We have much to discuss." She began with simple questions. How he'd entered the auction business, what his first sale had been like, whether he remembered the names of specific individuals he'd sold. The questions seemed innocent at first, conversational, the kind of inquiry anyone might make about someone's career. But gradually, the questions became more specific, more pointed. She asked about particular transactions. A girl of 8 years old sold away from her mother. A man with a partially healed broken leg that Gadsden had documented as fully healthy. A woman who'd attempted suicide the night before her sale, whose distress Gadsden had concealed from buyers. "I have excellent memory for names and faces," DeLine said. "I've made it my business to learn about your career, Mr. Gadsden. You've sold approximately 3,200 people over 7 years. Shall we discuss them?" And she did discuss them, one by one. She recited names, ages, descriptions. She described families separated, children sold away from parents, elderly slaves disposed of when their productivity declined. She knew details that shouldn't have been possible for her to know, private information from sales records, from buyer correspondence, from the whispered conversations that happened in corners of the auction house when Gadsden thought no one was listening. As dawn approached, Gadsden sat in his chair, no longer maintaining the composure he'd prided himself on for years. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't accused him, had simply asked questions and recited facts. But the accumulation of those facts, the relentless documentation of his complicity in systematic cruelty, had stripped away every justification he'd built over the years. "You told yourself you were just facilitating commerce," DeLine said as the first light began to filter through his office windows. "That you weren't responsible for the system, that if you didn't do this work, someone else would. These are the same justifications every participant in evil uses. The soldier who claims he's just following orders. The bureaucrat who says he's just processing paperwork. The businessman who insists he's just responding to market demands. I didn't create slavery," Gadsden said weakly. "I didn't invent this system." "No," she agreed. "But you participated in it with meticulous precision. You documented it. You refined it. You made it more efficient. You turned human suffering into neat columns of figures in your ledgers, and you profited from it while maintaining the fiction that you were somehow separate from the evil you were facilitating. What are you? Gadsden asked. How is any of this possible? Does it matter? Deline replied. Whether I'm exactly what I appear to be, a woman who's been sold repeatedly by men who found her presence unbearable, or something else entirely, the facts remain the same. You've spent 7 years as an instrument of systematic cruelty. That truth doesn't change regardless of my nature. She stood, moving toward the door. You'll authorize my resale tomorrow. You'll take whatever loss is necessary to be rid of me. And then you'll spend the rest of your life knowing exactly what you were complicit in. That knowledge will never leave you. Every time you close your eyes, you'll see their faces, the 3,200 people whose names I recited tonight. You won't forget them. I've made certain of that. She departed, leaving Gadsden alone in his office as full dawn arrived over Charleston. Gadsden authorized the resale that afternoon. Claiborne accepted the documentation without comment. Who will be the last buyer? Gadsden asked. His voice sounded hollow, scraped clean of whatever confidence had once sustained it. Someone who represents the culmination of this education, Claiborne said. Someone whose position embodies everything the system has created. Someone whose family has defended this institution not just through ownership but through philosophy, through law, through the construction of elaborate moral justifications that have poisoned generations. Gadsden spent the days before the final auction in a state of numb anticipation. He continued his duties at Ryan's Mart mechanically, processing other sales with the same precision he'd always maintained. But every transaction now felt like participating in something obscene. He saw the faces Deline had made him remember, the 3,200 people whose names she'd recited during that endless night. They haunted him during waking hours and invaded his dreams when he managed brief periods of sleep. He noticed changes in himself that he couldn't quite articulate. Food tasted different, less substantial. Conversations with business associates felt hollow, their concerns about profit margins and market conditions seeming trivial against the weight of what he now understood about the trade that sustained them all. His hands shook when he opened his ledgers, those meticulous records that had once been sources of professional pride, now reading like catalogs of systematic destruction. David Brunson visited him twice during those days, concern evident in the former constable's expression. You look like hell, Thomas. Whatever happened between you and that woman, it's eating you alive. She made me count them, Gadsden said quietly. They were alone in his office, the auction house closed for the evening. Every person I've sold. She knew their names, their ages, where they came from, where they went. She knew things I'd forgotten, things I'd deliberately chosen not to remember. And she made me remember all of it. That's not possible, Brunson said. Those sales happened over 7 years, thousands of transactions. No one could know all those details. She knew, Gadsden insisted. She recited them for hours. A girl named Sarah, 9 years old, sold away from her mother in June of 1839. A man named Jacob with a scar on his left hand, 62 years old, disposed of when his productivity declined in March of 1841. A woman named Rebecca, who begged me not to sell her to a particular buyer because she'd heard stories about his cruelty. I sold her to him anyway because he paid well. Deline knew about Rebecca. Knew exactly what happened to her afterward, details that never appeared in any official documentation. Brunson studied his friend's face. What are you going to do? I'm going to document the final sale, Gadsden said. Because that's what I do. I document transactions. I create records, even when those records are evidence of my own damnation. The auction was scheduled for October 26th. Despite Gadsden's attempt to keep the sale quiet, word had spread throughout Charleston. By mid-morning, the auction house had begun filling with observers. These weren't the usual factors and plantation overseers who attended routine sales. These were Charleston's elite themselves, men who rarely appeared personally at auctions, preferring to send agents to handle such business. Gadsden recognized faces he'd only seen before at the Charleston Club or at St. Michael's Church, the Ravenels, the Alstons, the Pringles. Men whose families had shaped South Carolina's history since colonial days. Men whose wealth derived not just from agricultural holdings, but from banking, shipping, factoring, the entire economic ecosystem built around slavery. The atmosphere in the auction house felt different from any sale Gadsden had conducted. Usually, auctions carried a business-like quality, transactions proceeding with commercial efficiency. But today, tension saturated the air like humidity before a storm. Men spoke in hushed tones, their conversation stopping abruptly when others approached. Eyes kept darting toward the door, waiting for Claiborne to arrive with Deline. When she finally entered, accompanied by the factor, a palpable shift occurred in the room. Gadsden watched Charleston's most powerful men react to her presence, not with the calculating assessment usually directed at slave merchandise, but with something more complex. Fear mixed with fascination, desire complicated by dread. Several men who'd purchased her previously were present, though they remained at the back of the room, their faces carefully neutral but their postures tense. Gadsden took his position at the front of the auction house beside the platform where merchandise was displayed during sales. His hands trembled as he opened his ledger to a fresh page, the final entry in a sequence that had consumed 8 months and destroyed 17 men's peace of mind. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying through the crowded room with practiced authority that felt increasingly false, "we proceed with the sale of inventory number 84473. Female, approximately 28 years of age, experienced in household management, fluent in French, skilled in needlework and music, literate. Notable marking, 3 dots forming a triangle on the left shoulder blade." He didn't mention the 16 previous sales. Didn't reference the impossible pattern that every man in that room knew about but no one would acknowledge directly. The omission felt like complicity in a conspiracy, though Gadsden could no longer distinguish between the conspiracy and the normal operations of his business. "Bidding opens at $5,000, Gadsden announced. The response was immediate and aggressive. Voices called out bids in rapid succession, prices climbing with a speed that transcended any rational economic calculation. $6,000. $7,000. $8,000. The increments grew larger as men abandoned caution, driven by whatever complex motivations had brought them to this auction. Gadsden recognized the psychology at work. These men had heard about the previous sales, about prominent buyers who'd resold her at substantial losses. Each bidder believed he would be different, stronger, more capable of maintaining control over property he purchased. The arrogance that came with vast wealth and social position convinced them that whatever had broken other men wouldn't break them. When bidding reached $10,000, Gadsden noticed Langdon Chivas Jr. entering the auction house. Chivas moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone accustomed to deference. At 39 years old, he represented Charleston aristocracy at its apex, old wealth, political connections, absolute certainty in the righteousness of Southern institutions. His family had defended slavery not just as an economic necessity but as a positive good, a moral benefit to both enslaved and enslaver. Chivas raised his hand. $12,000. The room fell briefly silent. That sum represented an escalation beyond what even the previous aggressive bidding had suggested. Other bidders hesitated, recalculating their limits, weighing their desire for acquisition against the insanity of spending such amounts. $13,000, called Augustus Rhett, a planter whose Georgetown holdings produced some of South Carolina's finest rice. $15,000, Chivas responded without pause. $16,000, Rhett countered, though his voice now carried uncertainty. $17,000, Chivas said, his tone suggesting he would continue bidding regardless of amount, that he had decided to acquire this woman and no financial consideration would deter him. Rhett started to raise his hand again, then lowered it. Other bidders who'd been competing actively moments before now remained silent. The message was clear: Chivas had claimed this purchase, and challenging him further would transform a commercial transaction into something more personal, a direct contest of status and power that could have social consequences beyond the auction itself. Gadsden's gaze moved between Chivas and Deline. She stood on the platform with the same careful neutrality she'd maintained through 16 previous sales, but something in her expression suggested recognition, as if Chivas represented exactly what this sequence had been building toward. $17,000, Gadsden repeated. Going once. He paused, following the ritual form even though the outcome was now certain. Going twice. Another pause. Sold to Mr. Langdon Chivvis, Jr. The hammer fell, and Gadsden felt something fundamental shift in the room's atmosphere. Men began departing quickly, as if eager to distance themselves from whatever would happen next. Those who'd purchased a line previously left without speaking to Chivvis, their faces carefully expressionless. Chivvis approached the desk where Gadsden prepared the documentation. He signed the papers with a flourish, his signature bold and confident. "Have her transported to my estate this evening. I want her settled in the main house by nightfall." "Yes, sir," Gadsden replied. He watched Chivvis depart and noticed Claiborne standing near the door, observing the final buyer with an expression that might have been satisfaction. That evening, as Gadsden arranged for Deline's transport to the Chivvis estate, she spoke to him one last time. "You understand now, don't you, Mr. Gadsden, what all of this has been about?" "Education," Gadsden said quietly. "You've been educating us about what we've chosen to participate in." "Not all of you," Deline corrected. "Most people who participate in evil never truly confront what they're doing. They maintain comfortable illusions until death. But you 17, you've been forced to see clearly. To understand precisely what it means to own another human being. To comprehend the full weight of that relationship and your role in perpetuating it." "Why us specifically?" Gadsden asked. "Why these particular men?" "Because you represent the system at different levels," she said. "Chivvis and the others like him provide philosophical justification, the moral arguments that allow ordinary people to accept the unacceptable. You facilitate the mechanism, the daily operations that keep the system functioning. And all of you profit from it while telling yourselves you're not responsible for its cruelties." "What will happen to Chivvis?" Gadsden asked, though he suspected he already knew. "The same thing that happened to the others," Deline said. "He'll learn. And learning will destroy the comfortable certainties he's built his entire identity around." She was transported to the Chivvis estate that night, and Gadsden never saw her again. The whispers began within days. Household staff at the Chivvis estate reported unusual occurrences, their master spending entire nights in his study with the new acquisition, conversations that lasted until dawn, raised voices occasionally audible through closed doors, though never quite intelligible. Gadsden heard these reports through the network of gossip that connected Charleston's business community. Factors who dealt with Chivvis noted changes in his demeanor. The confidence that had always characterized him seemed diminished. He began missing meetings, failing to respond to correspondence, neglecting business affairs that had previously commanded his meticulous attention. On the fourth day after the sale, a messenger arrived at Ryan's Mart with an urgent letter from Chivvis. The handwriting was barely legible, letters jagged and uneven. "Gadsden, the woman is unsuitable. Utterly unsuitable. I cannot, the things she knows. I require her immediate removal from my property. Arrange whatever is necessary. I don't care about financial recovery. Just remove her." But before Gadsden could respond, a second messenger arrived with different news. Langdon Chivvis, Jr. had filed manumission papers with Charleston authorities. He was freeing Deline, granting complete legal freedom and providing funds for her transport north to Pennsylvania. The news rippled through Charleston society like a shockwave. Members of the Chivvis family didn't free slaves. They defended the institution publicly, wrote essays arguing for its moral necessity, shaped laws to protect and expand it. For Langdon Chivvis to suddenly manumit a woman he'd purchased just days earlier, a woman for whom he'd paid an astronomical sum, defied every principle his family represented. Gadsden examined the manumission documents when they were filed. They were properly executed, with all necessary legal requirements met. But in the margins, Chivvis had written additional notes, fragments of text that suggested someone in profound psychological distress. She recited the names, all of them. People my family has owned across 4 generations. She knew their stories, what happened to them, the specific cruelties, the children sold away, the families destroyed. She knew details that exist in no records, private matters that should be unknowable. She asked me how I justified it. made me articulate the philosophical arguments I've used to defend this system, then showed me with precise logic how each argument collapsed under examination. How every justification was simply elaborate self-deception designed to allow me to profit from suffering while maintaining my self-image as a moral person. The notes continued, increasingly illegible. I cannot bear the weight of understanding. 73 people across 3 plantations. I gave orders that led to their punishment, their sale. I thought I was managing property efficiently. She made me see them as human. I cannot bear this knowledge. Cannot continue with this understanding. Freedom is the smallest gesture, inadequate but necessary. Gadsden read these notes alone in his office and felt recognition of his own experience, the forced confrontation, the systematic destruction of comfortable illusions, the unbearable weight of genuine understanding of one's complicity. He began hearing similar stories about other men who'd purchased Deline. Robert Drayton had sold his Ashley River plantation and moved to Charleston proper, living quietly in a townhouse, his vast agricultural holdings liquidated. Charles Coatsworth Pinckney had freed 6 of his slaves, not all of them, but 6 specific individuals whose stories apparently paralleled something Deline had told him about. Theodore Gallard had stopped attending church, unable to sit through sermons that blessed the social order he now understood as fundamentally corrupt. None of these men spoke publicly about what they'd learned. How could they? Admitting that a slave had educated them about the immorality of slavery would destroy their social standing completely. Acknowledging that a woman they'd purchased as property had revealed truths they couldn't bear would be professional suicide in Charleston society. So they remained silent and suffered privately. Their transformations visible only in changed behaviors that their peers couldn't adequately explain. Gadsden continued documenting these patterns, though now his record-keeping served a different purpose. He was no longer creating business records, but compiling evidence of something that transcended normal commercial activity. He noted the dates each buyer had been affected, the specific ways their lives had changed, the pattern of destruction that had consumed 17 men across 8 months. Langdon Chivis's decline proved the most dramatic. His health deteriorated rapidly after freeing Deline. Physicians couldn't identify any specific disease, but something fundamental seemed to be failing in him. He lost weight despite eating. His hair grayed within weeks. He developed a tremor in his hands that made writing difficult. In December of 1844, Chivis sold the majority of his plantation holdings, thousands of acres, hundreds of slaves, the accumulated wealth of generations. His family was horrified, but he was the legal owner and they couldn't prevent the transactions. He used some of the proceeds to establish a fund for educating free blacks in Charleston, a gesture so contrary to his previous politics that many assumed he'd lost his sanity. He died in March of 1847 at age 44. The death certificate listed heart failure, but those who'd known him recognized that whatever had killed him had begun that night when he'd sat alone with Deline and been forced to confront truths he couldn't survive understanding. As for Deline herself, she vanished from all historical records after her manumission. The documents show she received funds for transport north and legal confirmation of her freedom. After that, nothing. No census records in Pennsylvania, no property holdings, no marriage records, death certificates, or any other documentation that would track an individual through the 19th century. Gadsden made inquiries when he moved to Baltimore, asking among that city's free black community if anyone knew of a woman matching her description. He contacted abolition societies in Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts. No one had encountered anyone fitting her profile. It was as if she'd accomplished whatever purpose had brought her to Charleston and then simply ceased to exist in any verifiable form. Gadsden himself survived until 1863, dying of pneumonia just as Union forces were beginning their campaign against Charleston. In his final months, he attempted multiple times to write a comprehensive account of what had happened in 1844. Stacks of incomplete manuscripts survived him, each attempting to explain the impossible sequence of events, each abandoned as inadequate to capture the truth. His final attempt began, "I have spent 19 years trying to understand what happened during those 8 months. Whether she was exactly what she appeared to be, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and education who somehow gained power over Charleston's elite, or something else entirely remains unclear. What is certain is that 17 men learned truths about themselves that destroyed their peace permanently. We were educated about complicity, about the specific ways we'd chosen to profit from systematic cruelty while maintaining comfortable self-images. That education was more destructive than any physical punishment could have been. The manuscript ended mid-sentence, Gadsden apparently unable to continue. When the Charleston Historical Society acquired his papers in the 1870s, they noted the anomalous series of sales in his ledgers from Ryan's Mart. In 1891, concerned about how Northern publications might use these records as anti-Southern propaganda, city officials quietly removed several pages documenting DeLine 17 sales. The pages were placed in restricted archives where they remained for decades, accessible only with special governmental approval that was rarely granted. Researchers who've studied antebellum Charleston occasionally encounter references to the case in private correspondence or business records that escaped archival censorship. But the core documentation, Gadsden's ledgers with their impossible sequence of sales, the private notes written by buyers, the detailed accounts of what actually happened, remains sealed. The official explanation, when pressed, suggests clerical errors or confusion between similar individuals. But Thomas Gadsden built his reputation on precision. His records show no evidence of the sloppy record-keeping that would produce such fundamental mistakes. What remains is whisper and speculation. Stories about the woman who was sold 17 times. About conversations that lasted entire nights. About powerful men who emerged from those conversations fundamentally broken, their certainty shattered, their comfortable participation in systematic evil transformed into unbearable knowledge. The South Carolina archives remain restricted. The pages removed in 1891 have never been returned to public view. And if you ask historians who specialize in antebellum Charleston about the anomalous sales from Ryan's Mart, most will tell you that no such documentation exists in accessible collections. But among serious scholars, questions persist. How could one woman be sold 17 times in 8 months? How could impossible documentation pass legal scrutiny from trained professionals whose careers depended on accuracy? And what actually happened during those conversations between DeLine and the men who thought they could own her? The simplest answer, and the most disturbing, is that events occurred exactly as documented. That for 8 months in 1844, 17 men who profited from slavery were forced to truly understand what they were participating in. That education destroyed them more thoroughly than any violence could have. And that somewhere in Charleston's restricted archives lies proof that sometimes justice takes forms we can barely comprehend. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or is there more hidden in those sealed archives? Leave your comment below with your theories about what really happened in Charleston that year. If this tale gave you something to think about, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We explore forgotten mysteries from American history every week. Share this with someone who appreciates dark historical tales. And I'll see you in the next video, where we'll uncover another secret that powerful people tried to bury.